At 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, August 15, 1971, the United States did what, in ordinary life, is called something simple. We changed our minds about paying what we promised. Friday the 13th. The British ambassador walks into the Treasury with one piece of paper. On it, a request for $3 billion in gold. 1/3 of America's gold reserve. One signature. By that point, the math was terminal. In 1950, the U.S. held 68% of the world's gold. By August 1971, it was down to 25%. There were now 4 times more dollars abroad than there was gold to cover them. For decades, the dollar was a check you could cash for gold at $35 an ounce, a promise the world built its future on. The dollar should have collapsed. Instead, it was set free. The U.S. assumed its allies were too afraid to act. They weren't. They just started counting. Today, the mechanics of how one country changed the rules of the game and why the world couldn't answer. In the summer of 1971, it didn't look like a world drama. It looked like a string of anxious phone calls and dry numbers in the briefings. No explosions, no tanks, no rallies, just markets doing what they always do when they smell weakness. They start testing the promise for stress. And the promise was simple, almost magical. The dollar is almost gold. Formally, foreign central banks could exchange dollars for metal at a fixed price, $35 an ounce. This wasn't a nice metaphor. It was the foundation of the system. Reserves sat on it. Exchange rates sat on it. Trust in the post-war order sat on it. And on that same foundation, the United States built its new role. Not just a country, but the issuer of the world's liquidity. It started with the politics of guns and butter. In the 1960s, the administration of Lyndon Johnson tried to do both at once: fight an expensive war in Vietnam and build the Great Society, large-scale social programs at home. There wasn't enough money for everything, so the printing press ran at full speed. More dollars flowed into the system, while America's gold stock quietly thinned out. To save the system, in 1961 they created the London Gold Pool, a consortium of 8 central banks that agreed to dump gold onto the market together if the price rose above $35 an ounce. It was a desperate attempt at collective defense, but by 1968 the pool collapsed under the weight of speculation. France under Charles de Gaulle left first, openly saying, "The United States is exporting its inflation to the whole world, and we no longer want to participate." De Gaulle began physically shipping gold out of New York to Paris on naval vessels. By August 1971, the game of cooperation was over. The game of survival had begun. By August 1971, the math was brutal. $10 billion in gold, $40 billion in foreign claims. If everyone shows up at once, the drawer is empty. And they started showing up, not in a panic, but in waves. Central banks don't do romance. They do math. And the math said, take the metal now. This wasn't an ultimatum. It was bookkeeping. The British were simply doing what the system promised, trading paper for metal. But when just bookkeeping threatens to take 1/3 of your reserves, it stops being just bookkeeping. The pressure grew so intense that the official stabilization mechanisms began to break. A fixed price is not a command. It's a contract held together by belief. And when belief drains out, the price becomes a target. Central banks watched the gold flow out, and every new signal strengthened the next one. When one player takes a step toward the exit, everyone else starts asking, "Are we going to be the last ones left holding paper?" And this is where the human layer appears. Politicians hate situations where they're forced to choose between bad and catastrophic. Nixon didn't come to power to explain to Americans why they should tighten their belts for some abstract international confidence. 1972 was coming, and in politics that always means one thing: every decision is priced not by a textbook, but by its electoral cost. Inside his circle, there were enough people who saw the world not as a club of allies, but as a market, where the winner is the one who dictates the terms. And gradually, inside the White House, the gold link started to feel less like honor and more like handcuffs, an external constraint that kept the United States from doing what it believed was necessary for its own economy. Washington's mistake was psychological. They assumed allies wouldn't dare test the dollar. But systems don't run on gratitude. They run on calculation. And if this feels like an ordinary bank run, you're sensing the right shape. Only the scale is different. In an ordinary bank, people rush the teller window. In the world system, states rush the window. And when the ones stepping up aren't a crowd but one or two of the largest holders, that's not panic anymore. That's an ultimatum wrapped in bookkeeping. From that moment, for the United States, everything narrowed to one question. What do you defend first? The international promise or the domestic economy? And the choice got heavier the more the world depended on the dollar. Because the deeper the world's dependence on America's currency, the stronger the temptation to solve the problem in a way that makes the holders of that currency pay. But the real intrigue is somewhere else. Many people assume if a country breaks its gold promise, its currency should die. Trust should vanish. Its global role should end. It sounds logical, and that is exactly why this story matters. After this point, logic will not behave. Because the United States reached the edge not as a weak debtor, but as the owner of the world's infrastructure, payments, markets, liquidity, trade contracts. A decision that looks like a financial betrayal can become the start of a new, stronger model of hegemony. De Gaulle saw the crack first, but he died November 1970, 1 year too early. The man who would feel the real blow was on the other side of the Pacific. His name was Sato. His reaction would become a single word that Japan still remembers. But first, what happened inside the room where 15 men decided to change the world. By the time the pressure on the dollar could be felt not only in briefings but in the behavior of allies, a different game had already started in Washington, the game of closed decisions. And here one thing matters. In public, the United States spoke about the stability of the world system. Inside the room, they spoke about the survival of the domestic economy and the political price of losing. Inside the administration, irritation kept building. Allies benefit from the American market, and at the first scent of risk, they run to the cashier's window for gold. Around Nixon, a circle hardened with a blunt logic. If the system starts killing the United States, then the system has to change. The question became, how do you do it without looking like the loser? They approached the decision like an operation. Arthur Burns wanted to defend $35 until the last bar. John Connolly wanted to slam the window. Schultz let the dollar float. 3 men, 3 futures, 1 weekend. And this is where what many later called cynicism begins. In reality, it was pure power technology. Don't fight the market and your allies on their field. Change the field. John Connolly, the Treasury Secretary from Texas, put the position bluntly. The dollar is our currency, but your problem. That isn't a joke. That is the logic that won. August 13th to 15th, 1971. Camp David. Nixon brings the key people together in a tight format, far from the usual public light. The atmosphere of meetings like this is always the same. Minimum romance, maximum calculation. At the table, it wasn't only finance people. George Shultz was there too, a future Secretary of State, and at that time the head of the Budget Office. As a student of Milton Friedman, he quietly insisted, stop trying to hold exchange rates. Let the market set the price of the dollar. His idea of floating rates sounded like radical heresy then, but it would become the future. What's just as telling is who was not there. Henry Kissinger, the foreign policy heavyweight, stayed out of it. Nixon deliberately left the State Department outside, treating it like a sieve. a place where any secret would leak to allies before it was time. A decision about rewiring the world was being made by a small circle of hawks and pragmatists. And in the cottage next door, speechwriter William Safire worked through the night on the address. Nixon personally marked up drafts, demanding that the words sound as patriotic as possible. He knew what he was about to do was, in practice, an announcement of economic war, but it had to be packaged as the rescue of the American dream. Paul Volcker, the Treasury's top international deputy, lays out the charts. The reserves line goes down. The conversion demands line goes up. The crossing point is somewhere in the coming weeks. Arthur Burns, the Fed chair, shakes his head. He's against it. Closing the window is a strike against the dollar's reputation. It's an admission of weakness. It's an invitation to chaos. Connolly, according to participants, cut him off. Arthur, we don't have a choice between good and bad. We have a choice between bad and catastrophic. And catastrophic is when the gold runs out, and the world learns it not from us, but from the market. Burns was left in the minority. 15 people in the room, 0 journalists. Even wives don't know where their husbands are. Secrecy is absolute, because any leak means a run from the dollar before the announcement. When Burns raised the question of international trust, Connolly's answer was instant. Trust doesn't feed the voter. The room understood. 1972 was coming. The core idea inside the room was simple, almost brutal. The United States is not obligated to be the only country that pays for the convenience of the world system. If Europe and Japan profit from a stable dollar and access to the American market, then they should share the costs. And if they won't agree voluntarily, they can be pushed through exchange rates, trade, and access to dollar liquidity. The plan took shape as a package because closing gold by itself would look too naked. It had to be wrapped in a story about protecting people and the economy. So, next to the main blow, they prepared measures that were politically legible. A freeze on prices and wages, trade restrictions in the form of an import surcharge, promises of temporary steps, and rhetoric about fairness. The package had to look like crisis management, not a refusal to honor obligations. But the weak link wasn't economic. It was psychological. The United States assumed allies would swallow the decision because they fear chaos more than humiliation. And overall, they were right. But they underestimated something else. After a move like this, America would stop being the arbiter and become an open player, a country officially placing its interests above its agreements. That changed more than exchange rates. It changed the tone of the era. There were warnings, too. Closing the window would trigger a chain of devaluations and a search for alternatives. But warnings get heard when soft options still exist. In 1971, they didn't. The United States prepared the public story in advance. Allies should look like the ones who undervalue America's contribution. The United States should look like the one that takes responsibility. A refusal to honor the promise would be sold as an act of leadership. In the global financial system, speed is power. They announced the decision when markets were closed, before allies could coordinate a response. The first rule of a confidence crisis is simple. The one reacting is already weaker. By August 1971, the choice narrowed to this: pain at home now, or pain abroad, spread across the world. Saturday afternoon, Nixon made the call. We do it. Not a question, an order. All that remained was to make the world hear protection, not betrayal. August 15, 1971. A Sunday, an evening, prime time. Nixon steps in front of the camera. He speaks calmly, almost casually, like he's explaining the rules of a new social insurance program. Words about protecting Americans, a temporary measure, that steady, confident tone. The most dangerous moments in financial history almost always sound the calmest. But in London, Paris, Tokyo, It's night. Markets are closed. Central banks are asleep. No one can respond, sell, or defend. By Monday morning, the world will wake up inside a new reality. And the first move has already been made. The core of the decision is the closing of the gold window, which means one simple thing. Foreign central banks can no longer exchange dollars for gold at the promised price. Not a complex adjustment, not a technical pause, but the practical shutdown of the old contract. To the domestic audience, it can be sold as a leader's strong move. To the outside world, it sounds like your reserve asset is no longer backed by what you were promised. And right here is where the logical death of the dollar should have happened. If a check can no longer be cashed, the check should lose its meaning. But in the history of money, logic often loses to infrastructure. The first reactions in moments like this are always the same: shock, bargaining, and a frantic attempt to understand what counts as normal now. Allies are angry because it's unilateral. Markets are nervous because a fixed system is turning into a floating one, and that always means prices get recalculated. But then a deeper mechanism clicks on. Where exactly is the world supposed to go, right now? And here's the paradox. Why didn't the dollar die? And why did it, in a certain sense, become stronger? Because by 1971, the world was too deep in. If you destroyed the dollar, you destroyed the ability to buy oil, food, or machines. The dollar became global economic oxygen. You might hate the person who controls the tank, but you can't stop breathing. But oxygen can be a weapon, if you control who breathes. That lesson would take a decade to arrive, and it would cost hundreds of billions. First to react was France. De Gaulle had died a year earlier, but his legacy, distrust of the dollar, was alive. The French had been trading paper for metal since the 1960s. Now they were right, and trapped. Being right doesn't convert into gold when the window is closed. Then Germany. The Bundesbank tried to defend the mark. It was pushed into revaluing. A quiet, bureaucratic fury. Japan learned last and remembered longest. For years, Tokyo had kept the yen artificially low so exports could run hot. Now they were being forced to revalue. Every percentage point was a hit to Japanese factories, to jobs, to the very export miracle they had built from ashes. And here a third element appears, one people rarely say out loud. The world could be angry, but it was built into the dollar system through its own interests. Allies held dollars not because they loved America, but because their exports, their growth, and their financial stability were tied to access to dollar liquidity and the American market. Dumping the dollar overnight would have meant setting fire to their own balance sheets. So protest turned into negotiation. When an unfair decision doesn't destroy a system, but cements it, that is the hegemon's main law. The winner isn't the one who always keeps promises. The winner is the one who can make a broken promise become the new norm. The popular version says, the gold standard got outdated, and the world naturally moved to a more flexible system. It's a convenient version. It removes responsibility. In reality, nothing was natural. There was a political decision by one country, made behind closed doors, announced at the moment when nobody could answer. This wasn't evolution. It was an operation. A rebuild of the world began. The old order was simple: fixed exchange rates around the dollar, and the dollar tied to gold. The new order became more complex. The dollar's rate moves, currencies begin to float, states learn to live with an unstable price of money. It doesn't happen overnight, but the starting gun has already fired. America's real victory was elsewhere. While the world argues about morality, the United States buys time and freedom. Freedom to print and borrow without a gold constraint. Freedom to push part of its internal problems outward through the exchange rate and through inflation. Freedom to turn deficits into an instrument. The United States could purchase goods and resources in a currency it also happened to issue. On the surface, it looks like they saved themselves. In reality, it's also a change in the nature of global dependence. If the system once promised, "You have a hard anchor," it now promised something else. You have liquidity and access. And access is a more modern form of power than gold. Gold sits in a vault. Access lives in rules. But the main question isn't how the United States did it. The question is who paid, and how a world that was told this was a temporary measure eventually discovered there was no road back. When the window was closed, the world first tried to do what it always does when a familiar order collapses: talk reality back into place. Allies protested, demanded explanations, searched for wording that would let everyone save face. But very quickly it became clear. This story was no longer about morality or diplomatic offense. It was about who controls the tempo and the terms. The United States didn't ask permission. It presented everyone else with a fact and instantly pushed negotiations into catch-up mode. In a financial war, the side that's catching up is always weaker. It answers someone else's moves instead of setting the rules. The first days after the announcement looked like a nervous montage. Ministry statements, phone lines, emergency meetings, attempts to understand what a fair exchange rate even means now. The fixed system stopped being a map everyone drove by and became an argument where each player pulls the blanket toward themselves. That's the moment stability dies. Not from one decision, but from the fact that everyone starts bargaining again over the price of money. Inside the American logic, it was relatively simple. The U.S. line was, the old system became unbalanced. We're being used. We're protecting our economy, and that's in everyone's interest. It sounded confident because the obvious fact sat behind it. Global exchange, trade, and financial markets still rotated around the dollar. If the dollar started to wobble, the whole machine wobbled, and the United States used that. But for the Allies, it looked different. They held enormous volumes of dollars in reserves because that's how the world order worked. And suddenly they were told, your protection is gone. This is no longer a dollar you can redeem. It's a dollar we promise to keep valuable in the way that suits us. Imagine you run the Bundesbank. You're holding $10 billion. You can sell, but that crashes the rate and burns your own reserves. You can stay, but now you're negotiating with the arsonist about fire insurance. There is no door 3. That's the trap of reserve dependence. The more you hold, the more it hurts to bring it down. A bargaining phase began over the new regime. The world searched for a new equilibrium. What should exchange rates look like if the dollar is no longer anchored to gold? What parameters will define confidence now? And at that moment, something unpleasant happened for anyone who wanted to punish the United States. It turned out there was nothing to punish it with, because a sanction against the issuer of the world's currency is either the creation of an alternative infrastructure or a willingness to absorb pain yourself for the sake of principle. And in the short term, allies had neither. And here is the cold fact. After the window closed, the world did not leave the dollar system. It stayed inside it and began renegotiating, as if the rule change were a natural event to adapt to, not an offense to punish. That is the moment of capitulation, not because someone signed a paper that said, "We surrender," but because the structure of dependence forced everyone to keep playing. The climax didn't arrive on announcement day. It arrived 4 months later, in December 1971, when new exchange rates were signed at the Smithsonian. Nixon called it the most important monetary agreement in history. The dollar was devalued by 8%. The yen rose 16.9%. Every percentage point a knife to Japanese exporters. The mark climbed 13.6%. In the photos, everyone smiles. In the hallways, they were calculating how much they'd just lost. In reality, it was an admission. The old system is dead. The new one doesn't exist yet, and the dollar remains the center by default. 14 months later, it fell apart. But by then it didn't matter. The world had accepted that exchange rates float, and the dollar stays central without an anchor. The bargaining was already happening under rules the United States had set unilaterally. Japan resisted the longest. It refused to revalue the yen. The result was that the next decade turned into a currency war with no clear rulebook. For Tokyo, this wasn't just a shock. It felt like betrayal. In Japanese memory, this moment is often called the Nixon Shock. By accounts from Japanese officials, Prime Minister Eisaku Sato, hearing the news, managed only a single word: "Soka." So that's how it is? Some say that for Nixon it wasn't only cold calculation, but personal payback. In 1969, Japanese Prime Minister Eisaku Sato had reportedly promised Nixon to limit textile exports in exchange for the return of Okinawa. When the Japanese industry blocked the deal, Nixon took it personally. This wasn't just economics, it was the Okinawa textile linkage coming home to roost. In Washington, it was taken as a stab in the back. The window closure and the 10% import surcharge became the answer that brought Japanese industry to its knees. Japan, which had built its miracle on a cheap yen and an open American market, suddenly discovered the rules had changed without its participation. It permanently altered the relationship between the two countries. Japan learned that America's security umbrella does not guarantee economic mercy. But there was another power watching 1971 unfold, one that drew exactly the wrong conclusion. The irony is that even the countries most furious had to admit the same thing. The United States could take this step precisely because the dollar had already become the global standard. What looked like the destruction of trust, in practice became a demonstration of power. We are so central that we can change the terms, and the world will still be forced to work with us. In public, it was framed as reform. Inside the professional logic, it sounded different. It was a repricing of all currency risk, the start of a regime where the exchange rate became an arena of constant struggle, and inflation became not a side effect but an instrument of redistribution. If gold once played the role of a hard arbiter, you can't print metal, then the new arbiters were markets and politics. And markets and politics are far more flexible and far more brutal. They don't offer stability. They offer a price that changes every day. The world didn't just survive a crisis. The world changed the rules of living with money. After 1971, one thing became obvious. International finance is politics in pure form, just expressed in numbers. Remember, oxygen can be a weapon. Here's what happens when someone controls who breathes. The bill for 1971 didn't arrive all at once. It arrived gradually, through specific countries, specific crises, specific lives. Britain paid in devaluation and humiliation. In 1976, the government was forced to ask the IMF for a loan, $3.9 billion, and accept harsh conditions. A country that had once been the center of an empire was now teaching its people to live by rules written in Washington. Mexico paid with the 1982 debt crisis. The country had borrowed in dollars at low rates, building ambitious projects. And when the United States raised rates to fight inflation, dollar debts turned into a noose. The government declared a technical default. The lost decade began. Argentina paid the hardest. Loans taken at 6% suddenly cost 20%. Dollar debts tripled in weight overnight. The country slid into survival mode and wouldn't fully recover for decades. For ordinary people in those countries, debt crisis meant very specific things. Wages that lose value faster than they can be paid. Stores with empty shelves. Lines for bread. Governments cutting education and healthcare because every dollar is being routed into debt service, owed to American banks. This is not an abstraction. It's the price families paid for a decision made at Camp David 10 years before some of them were even born. These weren't side effects. This was the bill for 1971, spread across a decade. The United States closed the gold window and gained freedom of action. But that freedom was paid for with other people's reserves, other people's inflation, other people's debt crises. For Arab oil exporters, it was a signal. The dollar is no longer tied to gold, which means the price of oil in dollars loses stability. 2 years later, they would trigger the OPEC shock. The price of a barrel jumps from $3 to $12, fourfold. This wasn't revenge for Israel. It was protection against devaluation. For Europe, it was a signal. We need our own currency. 20 years later, the euro appears, a direct descendant of the humiliations of 1971. For the USSR, it was a signal. The dollar is vulnerable. You can press. But they read the signal wrong. The Soviets saw weakness where there was a restructuring of power. They started buying grain with dollars, thinking they were outsmarting the system. They failed to see that the 1973 OPEC oil shock, where prices jumped 300% from $2.90 to $11.65, had made the dollar even more essential. A decade later, the trap snapped shut. Between 1985 and 1986, oil prices crashed from $27 to $10. The Soviet budget, dependent on dollar-priced energy, evaporated. January 8, 1976. Kingston, Jamaica. The world signed the death certificate of the gold standard. Name on the document, the Jamaica Accords. Beneficiary, Washington. The dollar became the global standard with no physical constraint, backed only by trust in American institutions. And the United States learned the lesson. Over the next 50 years, it would use the dollar as a weapon again and again. Sanctions on Iran, exclusion from SWIFT, the freezing of reserves, all of it descendants of that August Sunday. Today, any country whose reserves sit in dollars lives with the same risk America's allies faced in 1971. The rules can change overnight, and you find out from the news. The irony is that this is exactly how a betrayal became a system. In 1971, the United States showed it could remove the old anchor. In the 1970s, the world paid for instability. In the 1980s, it paid for stabilization. It's one line. First you lose protection, then you're offered a new order. And the price of that order is distributed unevenly. And one last question remains, the most unpleasant and the most modern. If the rules were rewritten once in 1971, what prevents them from being rewritten again, the moment it becomes necessary? If you think the Nixon Shock is just a story about gold, you missed the main point. This is a story about the right to change the rules. And in 1971, the United States did what, in almost any other situation, would be called a default on a promise. Only in their case it became reform, because they had the leverage, and the world had no symmetrical response. So here's the question. Would you want to live in a system where the rules of money can be rewritten in a single weekend, and the people who pay are the ones holding the reserves and the debts? Or do you think that's a normal price for stability, because the alternative would have been chaos? Write in the comments. Was it a betrayal or inevitability? And the most important question, what is the new gold window today? Access to SWIFT? Dollar reserves? Frozen assets? What can be closed next time to redistribute the cost of a crisis again? Subscribe. Here, empires fall from bookkeeping, not bullets.